Hi, friends. It's Rob here from Path2 Coaching. And this week's workshop is going to be on combining two of the topics that we address in blogs, which is stress and then being stuck. And we're specifically going to drill into what happens when we're feeling stressed and how that affects our ability to solve problems, and then what that does to us from an energy perspective and how that can affect our environment. And then we're going to drill down and get to two tools on how to deactivate that stress state and then be able to creatively solve problems and not necessarily be a toxic element in our environments and in the systems that we participate in. So let's get started with this, okay? So before I dig into that stress scenario, I want to share a little story with you. So for years, I operated under the premise that stress was an indication that I was working towards success, right? So if I was overwhelmed at work, if I was overextended either at work or in life, and if I felt that there just wasn't enough time or resources to get everything done, chances are I was doing a really good job at being hyper productive and then accomplishing more than the average person, and therefore I was successful. So the daily routine was essentially, wake up, dread what was in front of me, get to the office or begin working before I get to the office, and then battle through emails and meetings and stuff and just constantly getting amped the entire time. That kind of anger and frustration of, I don't have time for this. I can't be bothered with this. Why is that thing breaking now? And it would be all consuming. And so it was that kind of environment where it just lays on you and you wear it. But then what would happen is then I'd go home in the exact same stressed garment that I wore all day at work. And it was the same thing. So you'd walk in the front door and it was, why isn't homework done? Why is this thing a mess? And then the phone's buzzing with emails and texts and calls. And what was happening was I was essentially walking around as if I was emitting stressful radiation. And just like any kind of radiation poisoning over an extended period of time, that has a massive negative impact. And so those of you that know my story kind of know what happened, but it was not healthy for a family system or an individual. So that's what happens when we bring stress home. And I want to revisit this idea of, radiation and the fact that stress is kind of like radiation and it can contaminate things. So as we're going to get into that, let's first talk a little bit about what's actually happening in stress. So I find that most people identify stress primarily from work or primarily from things in their personal life beyond their control, like beyond kind of like their 3-foot world of influence, be that health, be that relationships, finances, things they can't immediately influence at that moment. In work is this interesting thing because it's almost like an indication that you are working if you're stressed. So it comes in a lot of different forms. But what I find is where people feel the most stress is where there's a lack of freedom, where they feel trapped in some element of either bureaucracy or their job or some limitation with resources or expectations that there's no way they could possibly meet. It's when they have objectives that are running against and counter to those conditions that it brings up a lot of feelings of stress. Now, all these conditions that occur either at work or in our personal life, we process these things as if they're threats. And they're threats in a sense that they are standing in the way of something that we want. And so maybe it's an actual objective goal we have set, a promotion, a sales quota, whatever it is. Maybe it's, hey, you need to get a certain volume of work done in certain allotted hours of the day. Or maybe it's a health matter where we feel that our health is at stake or the health of a loved one is at stake. It's the idea that we're processing that obstacle as a threat to something we want. So immediately we kick into our sympathetic nervous system, our fight or flight response. we go to a threat response. I am threatened. Get ready. We're going to fight our way out of this thing or we're backing out. One of the two. Now, what happens in that perspective is really fascinating because we activate to a level that we probably shouldn't. And we actually kind of spool ourselves up in that level. And I'll get into that in a moment. Okay, so let's talk about this stress for a little bit. And let's actually use a diagram to think about it. And if you're familiar with the Path2 program, the online course, you'll recognize some of the icons and the modeling that I'm going to use now. And so when we think about our goals, right, they tend to be goals that we set, whether they are an objective goal or an emotional goal that's kind of implied in that objective goal. We put them at the end of something, at the end of some sort of journey, at the end of some sort of process. Let's think about that journey or that process as essentially scaling a mountain, right? So we have this mountain here that basically says at the peak here, is where our goal is going to be, right? So this is the thing that we're pursuing. This is that the medal or whatever it is, your number one, what have you. And then where we are is generally an area that's far from that goal, right? Because we got to work toward it. And so we put ourselves in an area, right? And we're looking up on the goal and we're going to begin to move in that direction. But what happens is there's barriers along the way. So it could be a resource issue, like I don't have the money, the time, or the wherewithal or the equipment to get what I need to get for this objective goal, right? So barriers exist along the way. Now, normally if there's a barrier between us and a goal, we'll problem solve that. But let's raise the stakes on the goal a little bit. Usually when we're chasing an important goal, there's some sort of emotional reward that we're hoping to get once we get there. Right? So we think when I get to this goal, I'm actually going to feel something. So it's something that we have an emotional attachment to. And it's something that says, this is why it's important to me. Well, now, all those barriers are no longer standing in the way of a goal. They're standing in the way of an emotion. And so now ups the ante on getting to this goal. So now all these little barriers, they start to look like barbed wire, right? Because they're agents of pain. They are actually stopping us and preventing. Every time we hit one, we feel pain. And the harder it is for us to get to our goal, the more we start to feel an ache, that emotional ache. That emotional ache is what changes stress from effort to pain. So when we're in a situation where we're stressed, we feel stuck beyond some barriers and we're trying to access an emotion to get the pain out of this process. That's where stress is dangerous. So let's think about that for a second. So there's this pain that we're feeling. And when we're feeling this pain from stress, that's what activates the stress response. The threat is there. I am not going to get what I need. Therefore, I need to fight for it or run away or just freeze because I don't know what to do next. That is where this becomes really interesting. So when we think about the effects of stress, let's understand it in this fight, flight, and freeze mentality. Okay, so there's kind of three ways that we respond, right? So here we are. And there are some threats that we are sensing in the environment, right? Our spidey sense is tingling and it's telling us, there's something coming in from here. There's something coming in from here. There's a possible threat here. So those are all the things that we're starting to process. Our spidey sense is saying there's a threat. We're going to respond. 3 responses, right? The first one is we're going to fight our way out of this, right? So we've got the sword, and we're going to battle our way out. The second is boom, I am out of here. I am running for the hills. I'm going to put my sneakers on, my little Nike swoosh or whatever that is, and I am running out of here. And the third is I'm going to pretend the threat doesn't see me. I'm going to ignore it and act like it's not there. I am just going to freeze. So like a block of ice, we just freeze. So we can battle, we can run, or we can freeze. Now let's look at what happens in the natural world, right? So you get this gazelle on the plains, and if it pursued by a lion, a predator, it kicks into the same response. It says, I can either stand here and maybe hope I don't get eaten alive, I can bolt and just get out of here, or I could try to fight if the lion is too close. And if you've ever seen footage, this is what happens. The gazelle runs first, and if the lion gets on it, it begins to kick and fight that threat. But when the lion is gone, the gazelle chills out. It deactivates its sympathetic nervous system. It's no longer in a stress response, and it chills. What happens when it's in that threat response is it is worried about one thing and one thing only: survival. It is not interested in thriving, right? So a lot of its unnecessary faculties shut off. It's no longer using a wide berth of view looking for a predator. It knows where the predator is. It now has a narrow field of vision because it is looking for escape. It is going in a singular direction or multiple directions in order to outrun that lion. It doesn't take that opportunity to then start to problem solve. Oh, how should I drink out of the oasis this afternoon? Or how do I get the leaves off the tree that I can't reach? It wants to survive. That's it. What happens to us? What happens to us when we're at work or at home and those threats are coming in and we kick into a stress response? But what doesn't happen? Our lion doesn't just chase us for a little while. Our lion is inescapable and inexhaustible because it is solely here. It is all based on our perceptions of the goals, that goal diagram. It's all based on our perception of our goals and what's in the way. And the pain that we feel is what activates it. So there's no opportunity for us to feel safe and to shut the stress off. So we are constantly in a fight, a flight, or freeze. Here's where this gets interesting. So not only are we not using all of our faculties, just like the gazelle isn't using all of its faculties when it's in fight or flight, we aren't doing that either. So that means we can't solve problems creatively, which is what we actually need to do to address the threats that we perceive, right? We need to be creative and problem solve. But we also begin to get affected by the negative consequences of stress. There's mental, emotional, and physical consequences that then we wear. That is what becomes that radiation I was talking about. So these 3 attributes or these three threat responses, the fight, flight, freeze, the way they tend to manifest in our behaviors aren't necessarily as obvious as fight or flight, right? What happens is they manifest in three characteristics. And it's something I talk about in the blog article on being stuck, right? Because remember, we're stuck from a goal and some emotional reward, and that's where the stress is coming from. So those three threat responses really comes down to retreating, scattering or grasping, and drifting. And what I mean by that is when, let's think about retreat. Retreat is essentially we are withdrawing from things. And I'm going to start providing details of that in a second. So retreat is I don't want to engage, so I'm going to back up. Scattering or grasping is I want to fight, but everything's up here. So what happens is it comes out physically and in actions as scattering and grasping. It is I start to do lots of random things to feel productive and feel like I have a sense of control, or that I'm possibly going to find a solution to the pain I'm feeling, not to the actual obstacles that are standing in my way. Or I drift, clock out. I'm just not going to do anything anymore. And those responses, how we manifest fight, flight, and freeze through scattering, retreating, and drifting, impacts the four pillars of our life. And this is where that radiation from stress really starts to have an effect. So let's look at that a little bit. So to understand how that stress becomes a radiation and affects the critical parts of our life, let's take a look at this. Right? So let's go back to where we are, right? So here's us, right? And we're all sorts of stressed out, right? We're just And so there's four pillars in our life, right? And so again, if you're familiar with the Path2 program and you've read the ebook or you're familiar with the online course, so there's four critical pillars in life that require them to be stable in order for us to have an actual stable life. And the four pillars are our self, so that'll be a little us here. It's our health, so let's make that the little cross symbol, right? It's our wealth, so let's make that a little bag of money, maybe, right? Little bag of money. And then it's our connections, the people in our life. So there's us, and then there's all the relationships we have, right? Those are the four pillars of our life. So what happens is, let's think about if my stress response becomes, let's start with retreating. Okay, so my immediate stress response is I'm really stressed out at work or I'm stressed at home. And it's something that's, again, it's in my head. It is not the actual lion behind me. And so I am constantly in a stress state. So here's what's going on is I am in this stress state and I'm basically going to have the effects of like radiation contamination or radiation poisoning. Right? So anything I do, I could be potentially negatively affecting. And that radiation kind of comes in two forms, right? So it can be the kind of radiation that gets on you, right? So it's on your clothes, it's on your person, which means when I go from work and I go home, I bring that stress with me. It's the equivalent as if I didn't leave the lion in the office, but I bring the lion into the house with me. And I begin puking out all of the problems at work, all of the things that are stressing me out. So and so didn't respond to my email, and this person did this, and this person, and I don't know if I'm going to lose my job. And so what happens is I bring the lion into the house. And now everybody feels that same kind of stress directly from that same agent. The second way it happens is when we ourselves become so negatively affected by the stress and that radiation that we actually mutate. We become somebody different. It affects our mental spot. It affects our emotional spot. It affects our values because we get so twisted by being overly exposed to this constantly elevated fight or flight. We see the world differently. We no longer can connect with the people at home. And therefore, when we come home, we're not bringing the lion home. We're bringing home something actually kind of worse because now we're coming back into a system where we are the problem because we're malfunctioning. We're no longer able to function in a society, and we're no longer able to function in that group or that system. And so the radiation has kind of two effects, right? It can be on you or it can be in you. But either way, it negatively impacts those four pillars. So let's look back at, okay, let's say I'm retreating. Okay, so what happens when you retreat from yourself? Well, there's that sense of loneliness. There's that sense of I don't even know who I am anymore. I lose all passion. Life's kind of bleak because remember, there's a stress. There's this threat that's inescapable. You can't solve it. You can't. So it's just I'm gonna just back away from this. I'm gonna dissociate from myself. What happens to your health? That's when we start saying, I don't have time for the gym. You know what? I'm just going to snack. I'm just going to have a couple drinks because, I can't. I just don't have it in me to do stuff that's healthy for me to maintain my health. What happens money-wise? Money-wise, totally disenchanted with work, right? I don't want to go. I'd rather just quit. I'm thinking of quitting. I'm thinking of changing my job. I'm thinking of running away from that cause, from that thing that I'm identifying as stress. In your relationships, it's that idea of breakdown in communication, lack of showing up. I don't want to participate. I don't want to call my friends back. I don't want to do anything. I just want to retreat. I don't want to engage. Now, what if instead of retreating, we thought about scattering? We're grasping. We're looking to fight. We're going to fight our way out of this, but we have no idea what we're fighting against or how we're going to do it. That's usually when we go through some sort of like radical transformation process where we're just like, I'm going to change my appearance. I'm going to get a haircut. I'm going to start wearing different clothes. I'm going to present myself differently. I'm grasping at anything to feel like this is going to work. So there's a lot of effort put into kind of redesigning who we are. And it's not the inner work, it's all the outer stuff because we're just grasping. When it comes to our health, that's where we get like hyper focused on things. That's when we start adopting crazy diets and crazy workout routines and crazy health kicks because we're searching for control of something that's going to make us feel productive, make us feel like we're making progress because we're not actually making progress on that goal or that thing that has the emotional reward associated to it. So we'll just do something to make it feel better. Money. This is part of spending money all over the place. That's where I need a toy to feel better. I need an experience to feel better. I need a vacation to feel better. Again, grasping. Connections. Sometimes that's when we actually get overly socially involved. That's when we start joining clubs and committees and volunteering for stuff. And we start to stretch ourselves thin in overcommitment because it's trying to compensate for this unaddressed issue that, again, it is causing all of the stress. And then lastly is drifting. And drifting is when it's just you clock out. And that's where depression lives. That's where, like melancholy and withdrawing from relationships and connections, all of that lives in yourself. That's where you just stop caring about yourself. That's where that sense of hopelessness and lethargy like really overtake us. We feel very down in those situations, and that's where a lot of really negative and very harmful lines of thought come from. And as it relates to our health, the giving up is just like, F it. I don't care anymore. I don't have time. It's not, I don't have time. I don't have time is retreating. It's, I no longer care. It's what's the point? That's when I stop taking the meds for my heart. That's when I stop watching what I eat. That's when I just don't care. Money, that's where it's like, it's not just that I'm going to quit. It's, I don't want to work. I don't want to get out of bed. I don't want to save. I don't want to pay bills. I don't want to do anything. Connections. This is where all dysfunction goes unaddressed, right? That withdrawing, the lack of communication. It's the, I know something's wrong, but I'm not going to do anything about it. So when we bring home stress, we're bringing home a sense of radiation, and it's affecting the pillars in life. And what happens is it manifests itself in those little symptoms. It's not obvious. The connection is not linear. Like, hey, there's this thing, this objective I have, and I have an emotional attachment to it. And that emotional attachment is not getting addressed. I was expecting to feel a certain way, and I can't feel a certain way. And those barriers are painful, and now this ache is what's actually painful, and I'm responding in a stress response. And then it manifests itself in all these forms of radiation that then negatively impact the pillars of my life, that then destabilize my life. And then usually you can fast forward to some point in the future when life has gone to hell and stuff is really broken. You're like, oh, how did I get here? And it feels like a mystery, but it's not. And all of this doesn't need to happen because we can deactivate that stress response. So let's take a look at that. So before we get a little bit into the techniques on how to stop it, let's also talk about like root cause, right? So the root cause in this situation, if you remember the original diagram with the mountain and the goal at the top and some sort of emotional reward. See, that emotional reward is there because it's either not getting addressed or it's not being met in other parts of our life, right? So if my emotional reward is a sense of belonging or a sense of value, and I'm not getting it in parts of my life where I don't feel it in my relationships and I don't feel it in my own self-worth, be it I spend all my day at work or I spend all my day managing my family, then when things happen, when goals or objectives come up, I start to misalign them and attach those emotional needs, those emotional rewards that I want to those objective goals that actually are not related. I just connect them because it's not getting met elsewhere. And if I think this goal, hey, I'm going to get this done, well, then and then I'll feel a certain way. It makes sense. And we do it intrinsically. We don't actually think about it. It just happens. But if we're actually able to get around and decouple the emotional reward from the objective goal, we can address the emotional reward and it short circuits all stress because it takes the pain out of it. Now the stress is just simply effort of pursuing a goal. It's not painful stress that says I am in a threat state. I'm going to be harmed or hurt. And that's the whole premise of Path2, right? So Path2 is all about decoupling the emotional reward from the objective goal and addressing all of this so everything else can just be effort. It's not stress. It's not painful. And we can get the emotional rewards we want now. Right? So that's the philosophy that I teach and that I really work with my clients on. So we could short circuit this whole thing, right? If we could find a way to address those emotional rewards, and the whole Path2 program is that process. But absent that, there's two things that we can do to shift ourselves out of that stress response, right? So the first thing we need to do is we need to stop this from overriding everything. So our brain, our mindset is the thing that's telling us we're still in threat mode. There is still a threat to something we care about, to what we think is our well-being. And so now we're having a stress response. So normally what we need to do, and maybe you've had to do this in a social situation where you got to take the keys away from somebody, right? Somebody's being a jerk. They got some road rage, maybe had a little too much coffee and they want to drive. And you're like, you know what? How about you ride shotgun for a little bit and with a sleepy eye Greg over here, take the wheel and we'll be okay. That's what we got to do. And so what we actually do is we let our body now take the keys. And we do this through a somatic check-in, right? So right now the brain is telling us we are at risk. There is a threat to us. The body doesn't sense it. There's nothing telling the body to inform the brain, hey, there's a problem, right? So think about the analogy of touching a hot stove. The brain doesn't know it's a problem until the hand says, that's really hot. Yikes. And it pulls body informed the brain. Threat, respond, flight, don't punch the burner, right? That's what we do. So we can use the same process to deactivate the stress response. And what we try to do is do essentially grounding or a somatic connection with our body. And it's where we stop listening to our brain, go through a grounding exercise, and have our body inform the brain. And I think it's kind of cool. Like, let's do a limb check. All the limbs are there, all the digits are there. We're here, we're breathing, we're okay. We can manage our breath. I can count my breath. I can hear the birds outside. I can see all the red things in the room. I can feel the shirt on my body. Like, what are you talking about? We're good. A routine somatic check-in process is a really effective way to shift out of that fight, flight, or freeze threat response, because the body then informs the brain, hey, we're cool. Like, you need to dial it down a little bit. And you'll notice if you're someone who practices meditation, or you're someone who does somatic check-ins or goes for massages, or someone who works out or runs, if you think about it, usually in the midst of that kind of activity, running, working out, getting a massage, either in the midst of it or right after, is where we often have clarity in solving problems. That's where we come up with ideas. That's where we're like, oh, you know what? That's what I'm going to do. I know it happens a lot for runners. When they get done a run, they're like, I had a great thought while I was running. And the reason is because we took the keys away from the brain. We took the keys away and said, look, you're too stressed out to handle this. Knock it off, sit back there, chill out, and let the body take control. And so I'll share with you, I'll put down in the links below the video, some grounding exercises. There's one I really enjoy, which we did in the anxiety workshop, which was, am I naked? So that's always a fun one to do. But it's dialing back in to the somatic response immediately. Brings you out of a threat response. Now, it's not like, hey, I did that. I sat in a chair for 5 minutes, Rob, and now I'm good, and my stress is still here. It takes practice because you're constantly shifting the brain. And the moment you give your keys back to your brain, what do you think it's going to do? It's going to floor it on all the problems you had, all that stress, because it's all perceiving it. The idea is to take away the perception tool from the brain and give it to the body, and let the body determine whether or not you're actually at risk enough to warrant staying in fight, flight, or freeze. When you shift out, there's a tremendous amount of clarity we get for solving problems and for seeing things the right way. And that goes to the second tool, seeing things the right way. So let's say and this happens to me a lot, the brain has an iron grip on the wheel, and it's like, there is no way I'm letting go. I am too smart for this. That's when we can engage in reality testing. And the reality testing really needs to understand how to ask questions. Your brain is not going to constantly second guess and work around, right? So it's that kind of line of questioning that's, how true is this? Oh, this work product is never going to get done. These problems are going to happen. And we begin to stress about stuff that we anticipate. And that's where the reality testing comes in. How true is that? Do we know that's going to happen? Why are we getting so worked up about this? Have we handled something similar to this before? Can we navigate this? It's making the mind play itself. It's almost like war games when Joshua had to play tic-tac-toe against himself and he realized there's no winner. That's what we do. We essentially turn the brain back on itself and say, okay, smarty, tell us, do we know this for certain? Is this guaranteed to happen? How do we know this for certain? What's going to happen? What that allows us to do is separate that constant barrage of internal advice. And we begin to bring in a second counselor, essentially challenging that advice. It dials it down and it allows us to break down the thing that we're perceiving as a threat. So we can tune into our body, or we can give into our brain and play its game, and we can play our own little game of tic-tac-toe of how true is that? Is this something that we know for certain? And it's that routine practice, somatic check-in, and kind of that internal inquisition that allows us to shift out of that stress response. Now remember, whatever that is, whether that's work or at home, we're going to get triggered back into it. And we have to correct ourselves and bring ourselves back. Now, the reason this is really important is kind of twofold. So the first is the obvious one that I illustrated with the 4 pillars. Unchecked stress really can destroy your life. I'm an example of that. It literally took everything from me. My inability to shift out of my threat response and to not constantly be retreating or scattering or drifting. All of that destroyed all my important connections in life. But secondly, the most important thing, or I guess equally important, because that's actually really important, but we're unable to be creative when we're in a stress response. Almost all the problems that stand between us, the bottom of that hill, and our goal there just requires creative problem solving. And when we're stressed, we can't think creatively. And so by coming out of it, we're able to minimize the damage to the 4 pillars in our life. And we're actually able to better solve the things that we think are the real problems. The only thing that's stopping us is operating in a constantly stressed state. And it doesn't take a whole lot for us to shift out, right? It's that let your body kind of inform your brain, let your brain figure out that it's talking a whole load of nonsense, or do that bigger work to disconnect the emotional rewards from the objective goals. And so hopefully you found this helpful. Feel free to send in any questions, or we're going to be revisiting topics like this over time. And yeah, thanks for spending your time with me, friends.